secondary data or primary data collection? That's always a good question. And a lot of people are always concerned that secondary data collection might be not as highly rated as primary data collection, and that's definitely not the case. The main difference between primary data collection and secondary data collection is really that primary data collection means that you are collecting it. So it hasn't existed before. It's on your design, and you have designed the questionnaire, you have designed the interview schedule, you have conducted the interviews, and you have transcribed them, analyzed them. So you're very, very close to the data, and you know the data normally inside out. Secondary data collection means that you're making use of data that's already available. So that means you don't necessarily go out and ask people about their opinions about a certain product or service, but you make use of company data, for instance, and you interrogate that either quantitatively or qualitatively. Or you can use national statistics data or database data, or a lot of online and website information, for instance. So if you're comparing entry modes of a number of different companies, they're all in the same industry, for instance, you can do that by analyzing their websites or mission statements, and you want to analyze their values and things like that. So that's secondary data analysis. There, as I said, there's not one better than the other. It depends how you analyze it and what your conclusions are. So it's the value and the quality of the analysis is down to the researcher, basically. And that's what will give you a high mark or not in the end of the day. There are some downfalls with secondary data analysis, for instance, that you don't have with primary data, that you sometimes don't know where it's coming from. So it might be already biased or influenced, or it might be wrong, or there might be variables collected that you are not necessarily interested in, but they haven't looked into it differently, or you don't agree with the research design itself. There's also the aspect of how credible is the source. So for instance, if you use national statistic data, then that's quite credible. But if you might use a market research database that nobody knows of, then you might question that a little bit, and you might do more research into that area. And you also don't know how ethical it was, how it was conducted. So there's some pitfalls. But similarly with primary data, there's always the question of access. Some people have really good ideas of how they interview CEOs or directors of XYZ, but then you can't get access to those people, or they won't tell you what it is. Quite often you only have one shot at an interview or a focus group setup. So the pilot testing that you can do with quantitative stuff quite often isn't the same. So there is a bit of risk involved. You might record it, but suddenly the batteries run out. So you need to think about it in a very different way. And you then have to work with what you have, and sometimes you have to eliminate certain interviews maybe because they don't fit the purpose anymore. You need to think about your environment. So let's say you say, okay, let's do an interview in a cafe, and it's really, really loud in the background, and you can't actually hear the answers when you analyze it. So you need to think about these things beforehand, actually. So that you can eliminate any issues that arise later on when you analyze the data. So again, there is no big difference between collecting primary or secondary data. They're both equally valid, and it really depends on the researcher's skill to interpret and analyze the data and link it back to the research objectives, answer research questions, or verify or falsify hypotheses.